Hi, good evening, and thank you to everyone who's made it to our session here today. Our session is about war photography, and I'm going to start by announcing and saying that we're saddened that Samar Abu Elouf, the Gaza photographer who was supposed to be with us, was not able to make it. She's the heart and the focus of this session. Lauren and I are going to do our best to present her work. We have statements and comments by her that I am going to read throughout our session today. And I'm going to read a statement that explains why she couldn't be here. She was supposed to be here in person. She couldn't get the visa in time. And then she was supposed to join us virtually. And her statement will explain why she can't join us virtually tonight. Before we begin, just a warning that throughout the session today, we're going to be showing distressing photos. So we totally understand if some of you would like to leave. We understand that, and it's totally okay. We'll start with brief introductions, followed by comments that Samar had sent that I will read. And then we will start the conversation, and we're going to show 7 photographs that Samar took while she was in Gaza, followed by her comments and by Lauren's analysis. I'll start by introducing Dr. Lauren Walsh. Dr. Lauren Walsh is a leading expert in the visual coverage of conflict and crisis. She's a professor at New York University, where she is the founding director of the Gallatin Photojournalism Intensive. She wrote several books, including Conversations on Conflict Photography and Shadow of Memory. And she's a Fulbright specialist in photography and ethics. She's also an expert on journalism and mental health. And then it's my honor to introduce Samar Abu Elouf. I know Samar from before October 2023, and I feel lucky and fortunate to call her a very dear friend. Samar Abu Elouf is an award-winning Palestinian freelance photojournalist who was based in Gaza. She has been a freelance photographer since 2010, working with Reuters, the New York Times, and other international outlets. Samar has documented key events in Gaza, including the Great March of Return protests of 2018 and 2019, and the 11-day war in May of 2021, which destroyed vital infrastructure and killed over 230 people, including several of her own relatives. She also covered the current, since October 2023, she was also covering the war in Gaza until her home was partially destroyed. And I want to read a quote by Samar. Samar says, "The camera has made me a strong woman, and I will continue working and taking photos until my last breath." I'm now going to read Samar's statement, the one that she sent me last night. I am happy for this opportunity to speak, and I thank my friends Hoda and Lauren for organizing for me to speak today. I had hoped to be with you, but circumstances prevented that. Especially because of the difficult condition of my friend and colleague, the photojournalist Ihab al-Burdani. He was struck in the head by shrapnel and has been in a coma for 6 days after an Israeli strike hit the journalist's tent next to Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. The shrapnel penetrated his head, causing damage, and the extent of the damage is still unclear. Every day, we bid farewell to and lose dear friends and colleagues. I feel as though losing them takes something from my own life. Today, the world feels empty. The smile I had is gone, and I can only hope Ihab returns to life soon. The least I can do for him is to speak about him before you, wishing him a full recovery, and hoping these events will shift public opinion about the targeting of journalists. I did not cover this war for long, but I was there. I witnessed and documented the intensity of its early days while working as a freelance photographer for the New York Times. I never imagined I would one day leave my home and not return, but that's what happened. I left to continue coverage in the South, hoping it would be safer for fieldwork, in line with professional safety protocols dictated by the situation on the ground. But it later became clear there is no safety. Every place in Gaza is a target. The first shock was the targeting of journalists and their families. That was the biggest reason I made the decision to leave, hoping to return after ensuring that my children were safe abroad. It was a difficult experience for me and for them. My relatives were afraid of me and my children every time a journalist or their family were targeted. I had never experienced anything like this in any previous coverage. I tried many times to return, but I couldn't. I would sleep in the front seat of the car or on hospital floors, storing food and fuel in the back seat. It felt like a mobile home. At times, I went days without taking off my shoes because of the relentless, fast-moving events. I remember walking with torn, aching feet, stepping through all the pain, just to be able to tell the story.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And although there's two of us on the stage, I just want to reiterate that we are a panel of three. And together we have jointly written a statement that sets a foundational tone for what we'll talk about in the images that we'll look at. So I'm going to read that. We want to take a moment to speak about the unprecedented attacks by the Israeli military against journalists in Gaza. Since October 2023, over 175 Palestinian journalists have been killed according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Other organizations put the number over 200. A recent study by Brown University's Costs of War project found that more journalists have been killed by the Israeli military in Gaza since October 2023 than the number of journalists killed in the US Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the wars in Yugoslavia of the 1990s, and the war in Afghanistan post 9/11 combined. But this is not just about numbers. These journalists were killed while doing their jobs. They were killed while at home. They were killed in their cars and while in areas marked by the Israeli army as safe areas. They've lost loved ones, including children. They've lost their homes, their offices, their colleagues. They are living in tents and can't find food or clean water, especially since Israel blocked aid from entering Gaza in early March. And still, they continue to report. We say all of this not for people to feel sorry for them, but because they deserve our respect and our admiration for their resilience and their commitment to continue covering the horror that has become Gaza. We need to stand up to this. There has been no accountability, and as long as there is no accountability, this will continue. So today, we speak in horror and also in solidarity with the journalists who have been killed and those who continue to work under incredible, relentless conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Samar will offer us a first-person experience when we look at these photos, and Lauren will bring critical analysis and an editor's perspective. We'll start with an opening question, followed by discussion that revolves around the 7 pictures that we will show. But again, I want to warn you that the pictures could be distressing to some. So I'm going to jump right into it and ask you, Lauren, the premise of our session today is that this is different, that this has changed things. So can you tell me, is Gaza really different when it comes to photojournalism? And if yes, why?
Right. So we did have this idea, right? This was our premise. And as it happened the other night at dinner, one of the people I was dining with asked me essentially this very question and said, yeah, but is it really different from other wars? And I thought, yes, and let me walk you through it. And I made a few bullet points so I wouldn't forget, right? So the statement I just read to you underscores the enormous, staggering death toll that journalists have faced. It is unprecedented. There is also a lack of access to Gaza to international media. And what I would like to say about that is not that Palestinian photojournalists can't do the job 110%, but that they are the only ones doing the job. And as Samar's statement made clear to us, they are doing it all the time and without any respite, while losing colleagues, while losing family. There is no release from the pressures and burdens. There is also, with this particular war, a smear campaign against Palestinian journalists promulgated by Israel. And on the one hand, that's not different from other wars, right? It is an authoritarian playbook move to discredit the media, take control of the narrative, undermine the credentials and the integrity of the journalism that you don't like. But what's different here is a concerted and repetitive effort to label journalists as terrorists by way of justifying attacks on them, right? Justifying targeted attacks. I would also add that this is different from a traditional or a typical war where you often have a frontline space and then you can move back from a front line, right? And of course, civilians by international humanitarian law are protected. Journalists are specifically, according to the Geneva Convention, categorized as civilians. And from the perspective of someone who works on journalism safety or an editor, you know that if a photojournalist is doing a lot of heavy frontline work, it takes a toll. It's physically draining, it's emotionally draining, and what you need to do is rotate them in and rotate them out so that they can recover from the work they're doing and go back to doing their job. That's not possible at all. And I want to just reiterate what Samar said in her statement. There is no safety anywhere. The other ways in which this is different is the scale of intensity. We know from the headlines how dramatic and intense this is, and it is a tiny strip of land. It's also different in terms of the sheer amount of visual documentation, many of it coming out through social media, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen some of it very, very graphic, and we're going to talk actually about the role of graphic imagery and what winds up in the news and what doesn't wind up in the news. So those, to me, are just some of the ways in which this is a pretty radically different landscape.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We're going to start with the photos. So we're going to show the first one. This is a picture that was published in the New York Times, and I believe Samar won a number of awards for it. I'm going to read what Samar says about this picture. The first photo, the one of the children looking up at the sky, was taken on October 7th. I was moving from place to place and entered the school to cover the displacement of people fleeing from northern Gaza. I was speaking to a boy who was carrying his sister, and when I asked him about her, he told me her leg was broken, but there was no hospital to take her to. There was barely a minute between our conversation and the sound of bombing and planes overhead. As the explosions reverberated, all the children looked up to the sky to see the aircraft, and I captured the photo in that very second.
What I would like to add on top of this is just to remind everyone of the incredible opportunity that we have to hear Samar's words about her experience. This is something I have the privilege of doing because I work with many conflict photographers, but the typical news consumer never gets that. What you get is a caption underneath a photo, and I'm actually going to read you the caption that was published with this. Palestinian school children looked toward the sky at the sound of airstrikes on October 7 as Israel, vowing to eliminate Hamas, launched an offensive on Gaza. Right? You can hear the difference between what Samar said and what the New York Times gave us. The other thing that I would like to say, so this photograph is from October 7. As someone who specializes in conflict photography or war photography, if I were to say the term to you, war photography, most people tend to think of destruction, weapons, soldiers, death, and that is all war photography, and it is vital documentation. And Samar is going to show us war through a very different visual lens. She is focused on civilians and on society and what war does to society.
Here's what Samar says about this photo. I can't forget the sounds or the smell. The smell of bodies filled the place. More than 170 shrouded corpses lay on the ground in white burial cloths. I walked among them, breathing in the stench, hearing the cries. This woman was uncovering one body after another, naming each person as she went. At one point, she stopped by a body and she said, "You're finally at peace. You were in pain all night, in labor. You're free now from the pain of giving birth. You were so afraid." She was saying goodbye to her sister, who was supposed to give birth that same day, the day she died.
Again, I'll give us another perspective on this. Photos very effectively show you a space, but as you'll notice, Samar described multiple times the smell, right? She is there and we are not. She is also, in her job as a photojournalist, thinking very strategically, and I don't say that to make it sound clinical. And obviously she is surrounded by grief and death and smell and intensity, and she is also doing her job. So she's thinking, I need to show the scale and scope of death. And so she's framed it in a way so that we see many covered bodies. And she's working for the New York Times, and the New York Times is representative of a lot of Western media, and they are not very likely to show you extremely graphic, bloody, broken bodies, despite the fact that that is what happens in war. And so Samar is also thinking, how can I frame the scale and scope of death in a way that will also get published?
As for Khaled Juda, when I entered Al-Aqsa hospital that day to take photos, for the first time in my life, I saw up to 200 corpses on the floor. I mean, it was all white. The whole floor was covered with corpses. And I felt it was very difficult to see these people and think that these are people like me. They had dreams and aspirations. Then I heard Khaled screaming. His whole family was crying. I got close to them before I took pictures. I was trying to listen to what he was saying. He was walking around looking for his mother, moving between the bodies. I was taking the pictures while crying. I was very moved by him and his voice. It was heartbreaking. And the voice of his uncle saying, "This is your mother, this is your sister." It was very hard to see a child opening every shroud on the floor and kissing his mother, kissing his sister.
Most of us probably encounter news imagery on our phones at this point. So they're tiny little pictures, and they're also easy to scroll past. But if I can ask us for a minute to sort of be in this space with Samar and with the description she just gave us, if it feels like she is very close to what is happening, it's because she is. And what I would like to point out with that is, amidst enormous grief and shock and horror, she is working extremely sensitively, aware enough that she's not getting in the way of anyone, and essentially has the tacit permission to be close, very, very close, in order to do her work as a photojournalist.
There's sadly more to this story. A few days later, Samar wanted to take this boy's photo again, Khaled. So she found him at another hospital, as he had a surviving brother who was being treated there. I was happy that he had a living brother, but I was saddened that they lost their mother, father, and sister, she says. Before Samar left, she asked Khaled if there was anything she could get him. First he said, "Anything you want," and then he said he wanted chocolate. Samar bought chocolate. She could only find sugar-free chocolate. And she also got him some toys. And she found the uncle, but they had moved. So Samar couldn't see Khaled that day, but she did meet the uncle and give him the stuff. Later on, she met a relative of Khaled in Qatar. This is where Samar is right now. And she asked about Khaled. She found out that he was killed. She says she felt like it's one of her family. She was in denial. Samar wrote about this in the New York Times. "I can't forget Khalid's voice," she says. She says it was one of the hardest things she had to go through. Samar's words. This photo shows the overwhelming scale of the injuries. There was no available beds, not even desks. The doctor in the image is writing the patient's report while leaning on the patient, trying to help as quickly as possible with the bare minimum. Another nurse is inserting a cannula into the patient's hand while he lies on the floor.
So I'm really glad that Samar included this picture for us to talk about, because I'm going to read you a caption. A doctor fills out paperwork on top of a wounded patient on the floor at Nasser Medical Hospital in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip on October 24, 2023. I'm going to say something about that quote. So Samar works for the New York Times. She writes her captions for the New York Times, and her images appear in the New York Times, but they can be licensed and appear in other publications. This one was also run in Time magazine. And when they're licensed, Samar loses some control over what the caption says and how it's written. So I'm just going to read the caption one more time. A doctor fills out paperwork on top of a wounded patient on the floor at Nasser Medical Hospital in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip on October 24, 2023. What this caption doesn't do is tell you who injured him, who is behind this, who committed this. Every other caption that she submitted to the New York Times says things like Israeli airstrikes, Israeli intensified its air operation, Israeli military attacks, right? So she's clear to tell you who is doing what. And the point that I want to make is some news outlets do it correctly and some don't.
The hardest part every morning was running to the emergency room to document as many victims as I could, especially the children. I saw more children without their parents than I've ever seen in my life. Like this little girl, pulled from under the rubble. Everyone around her was still trapped beneath it. On some days, the number of the victims surpassed 1,000.
I just want to reiterate my point that she is a photographer in the midst of war who is focusing on civilians.
Samar's words. In this photo is my colleague Muhammad Al-Allul, a photographer for Anadalu agency, who lost 4 of his children. Only his son Adam survived, while his wife sustained life-threatening injuries. He also lost 4 of his siblings, 3 of their children, and several friends and neighbors. Muhammad has not been able to recover from these losses. He misses them during holidays, special occasions, and every morning and every night.
This image is heartbreaking. It's an image, of course, that asks us to think about the role of the press and the extreme tolls that they endure. But what I would also really like to highlight is the hand just left of center, the hand that is touching him. And to me, this is, in the midst of essentially what is the most horrific moment, this is a gesture of humanity and a gesture of love. And it echoes very much something that Samar told me, and I'm just going to read these words. When she said these to me, she was talking about her photojournalism broadly, but it really spoke to me as I looked at this. She says, "These are people in the pictures. These are not just pictures. They are human beings who feel and wish to live in safety, security, and peace.
And this is going to be our last, this one is our last picture. After leaving Gaza, I tried to continue my work by following the injured who had been transferred to Qatar for treatment. I documented their stories in a piece for the New York Times titled Out of Gaza. One of the injured was 9-year-old Mahmoud Ashur. He lost both his arms in a strike that hit them as they were fleeing their home. When he was injured and the bombing intensified, he told his mother to leave him behind and continue. "I'm going to die," he said. When Mahmoud woke up and began to understand the extent of his injuries, he looked at his mother and asked, "How will I hug you now?" Today, Mahmoud can't use his hands for even the simplest things, like scratching his face or going to the bathroom. His parents help him with everything. He dreams of getting prosthetics that can help him live the rest of his life with more independence.
I have to confess on both of our behalves that when we read that, we both cried. It is really sad, and at the same time, what I want to show to us is the dignity that Samar has visually put into this image. And so as somebody who kind of teaches and writes about the history of war photography, there is a very stereotypical, traditional way that typically outsiders of a community take a picture of, in their words, it would be victim. Here we might say survivor. And it's often to point out the damage done. And it's often taken from an angle, of a higher angle looking down on. And so you'll notice that Samar has lowered herself. She is right on level with this boy. She is not putting herself above him. You'll also notice that, yes, his arms are amputated, but they're also in shadow. She's not defining him by his arms. His face is what is highlighted. His face is who he is. And this is I can tell you from kind of experience and knowledge, this is a break from a typical portrait of someone who is wounded.
So that's it for the photos. I know this was difficult, not just the photos, but the stories and Samar's comments. Let's talk about some of the things you mentioned, Lauren. The graphic imagery. What is considered graphic? And can you give us an idea of what are the different standards as to what's graphic, what's not graphic, are the different rules for like front page versus not front page, or is it like a blanket, standards?
There are unwritten, but kind of patterns that happen. And the first thing to say is that different parts of the world have different standards when it comes to graphic, particularly kind of dead bodies or bloody bodies. The global north, so let's say Europe and America, tends not to show as much of that kind of imagery. The editors will say, we don't want to revolt the viewing audience. We don't want to lose their attention. At the same time, they are making decisions to censor some of the images because this is really what happens in war. There's also, historically, at least in kind of Western media, a double standard about which dead bodies we do tend to look at, particularly in terms of showing their faces or identifying features. And there have been a number of studies that show that Black and brown bodies are given sort of less dignity, you could say, in terms of when they're portrayed in media, and white bodies tend to have a more protected status. It is a complete double standard, and I think it is starting to shift in part because people have been calling it out, but I think it probably still exists.
Have you seen, like with Gaza, have you seen any change, any shifts in either of those standards, or are there any discussions in newsrooms, people on the other side saying, like, this is, like what you just said, like, this is happening, we need to show it?
I think there's still double standards. And I was at a panel on Thursday, I think, and a point was made. So for those who may not know, there was a journalist tent where journalists were working in Gaza that was struck by, it was an Israeli attack. Journalists died, others severely injured, and there's video of this. There's video of people on fire. This is not run, and I'm going to use the New York Times here as an example. This was not run in the New York Times. And again, the New York Times editor is going to say, it's too graphic, we can't show that. As I mentioned before, the killing of journalists it's a war crime. It's a violation of the Geneva Convention. So we need to think about, is this newsworthy or not? How do we make this kind of a decision? What do we not show? What do we hold back? By comparison, what I would like to point out is not long ago, like within the past, let's say, week, maybe week and a half, there was another piece in the New York Times that I read, and this is about Ukraine. And it was also about a violation of Geneva Convention. It was also about a war crime. And this was a piece that talked about how Ukrainian prisoners of war were being executed by Russian forces. And there's videos of this. And the New York Times ran the videos. And they don't show you the exact moment of execution. They black it out, but they let the audio roll. So you do actually see and feel and experience a war crime. And I don't think there are enough discussions about why are we looking at the visual documentation of some deaths and not the visual documentation of others.
What would you, like, what, if you were a photo editor, what would your standards be with regards to what to show and what not to show? Do you, and also, like, I don't know if you follow some of the Arab, maybe, media, and they have, you know, they show a bit more than what we see in the Western media.
I mean, I think part of the calculus, to the extent that an editor can do it, you should be working very closely with the photojournalist. And I think if it's going to be imagery that shows dead bodies and identifies them, to the extent possible, if the photojournalist has a sense of whether surviving family members are okay with publishing that image, that to me makes it more allowable to publish. If you don't have the permission, it puts it in a trickier territory. I mean, given that we all now receive our news digitally, it is also simple enough to warn people, right? To kind of put a screen over first saying, this is going to be graphic, or in exactly what we did for this. I can't give a hard and fast rule on this, but I certainly think it's a conversation that needs to be had.
How about children? Are there special standards or rules regarding showing pictures of children?
I would bring the same sort of concerns to this, which is to say, as much as the editor is often saying, I don't want to harm the audience, I don't want to revolt the audience, I also think as important is to say, is the publication or the distribution of this image liable to harm the individual pictured, right? Will this come back to hurt them in a week or a year? And trying to think through the various trajectories of images.
You're also an expert on journalists and mental health. So can you speak a little bit about this when it comes to the photojournalists in Gaza? There's many of them still there to this day.
I can't begin to describe how much of a crisis it is. And I think in part it is because there is no relief. There is, you know, one thing that I hear a lot from photojournalists working in war zones is, I took on risks, I did my job, I submitted the pictures were disseminated, and the injustices don't stop. And there's this, it's an unfair burden that they put on themselves, but a lot of them internalize this anyway, this idea of, I must be failing at my job because this horror isn't stopping. And so I think that's just one little piece of the mental health issue here. But when you're talking about genocidal actions and you feel like I'm the one who has to create the visual documentation so I can put it out there and have leadership make this stop, and when it doesn't stop, it takes a huge toll.
Let's take some questions. We have some time for questions. If anyone has a questions, please raise your hand. Here, let's wait for just 1 second.
Hi, thank you very much for the three of you. It was, I mean, of course I cried because it was very painful to see it. And I want to, I mean, beyond the thank you, I wanted to also, I mean, stressing that I agree with you that we have to publish more these graphic photos, as they are called, and we should infantilize the audience. But on the other side, I came from a tradition, I'm a Spanish speaker, so I've seen what is happening in Mexico with the cartels and of course with Daesh also in Middle East, when it was very graphic photos, sometimes goes the other way, no? It's too much. So what I really thought that works with these photos, it was some more thoughts, somehow like this idea of the photo never helps 1,000 words, because we needed the words surrounding this story. So it's still, as we were saying, okay, we should put some more graphic photos. I've seen the other side, and it's very dangerous. So I wanted to know a bit more about what you think to find this equilibrium, because we should know what is happening in Gaza, but we cannot just be bloodthirst, no?
Yes, excellent point. There are a number of risks with continually publishing extremely graphic imagery, and one of the risks is that the public actually gets used to it, and you lose their attention when it's more graphic and more graphic, and they feel like, well, I've seen that already, it's not so bad. I tend to be of the mind that photojournalists should make all the pictures, right? Like create the visual evidence and then think it through when it starts to come to these kinds of questions that you're asking. And it may be the case that for certain spaces or at a certain time, it makes more sense to go more graphic, and at other places, other times, it makes more sense to hold back a little bit. Inside a newsroom, one of the standards that an editor is going to have for anything, whether it's graphic or has some other kind of very critical ethical question attached to it, is does the newsworthiness of this image outweigh the concerns that we have? And if the answer is yes, then maybe you publish. But if it can be done with a different image, or if it can be done with words, then maybe you do that if the consequences for using the image may be too severe.
Thank you, Lauren. Any more questions? Yes.
Rowan Dahmen from Arij, Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. I think it's extremely important to say that Palestinian photographers in Gaza are some of the best artistic photographers, even in the whole historical Palestine and in the region, and that Israel targeted those journalists and photographers, and there has been evidences that Gaza project that Arij was part of documented that they were targeted because of those pictures. We have been 18 months into the war, and I think the problem is that Israel doesn't want those pictures to come out, because that's part of the narrative that they don't want to get, and many of those journalists have been killed, injured, they needed to leave, if they are allowed to leave, and I think those pictures should be part of accountability in the future. So I would like to know, where do you think those pictures can lead in the future? Thank you.
I think you're right with your point, and this is one of the things that I find very important about photojournalism is that it is extremely powerful, and you know that as soon as leadership tries to shut it down. You know that means it has power. In terms of what the pictures can do, I mean, this is a visual record of history, and certainly some of these images will, one hopes, be used in tribunals, exactly as you're saying, to hold perpetrators accountable for these actions.
Anyone else? So Lauren, maybe I'll ask you a question. As journalists, we do a lot of safety trainings. What's like, you know, for the journalists in Gaza, it seems that everything we've learned isn't relevant. It doesn't apply. Some of the journalists I speak with, they even tell me that they don't wear their flak jackets because they feel that if they wear the flak jacket, they're more of a target. But in general, like as safety, you know, procedures or processes that they should, what would your advice be?
I mean, to be honest, that's a really tough one, in part because we are in sort of an uncharted territory, right? So the typical safety plan for a space where there are missile attacks and, you know, shrapnel might be flying, the typical plan would be to have your vest and helmet on and maybe goggles. But when you're in a space where you are being targeted directly because you are a journalist, then you start to weigh the risks of putting on the clues that will identify you as press or not. This is even, in addition to wearing safety gear, photographers can't do their work without their cameras. That's another way of identifying the journalist that you're trying to target. So there's the safety specialist in me that is terrified by the idea of not wearing body protective gear. And I probably would still say to do that when possible, but the journalists know best the landscape in which they're working, and I wouldn't second guess them. And I mean, it's one thing for me to have the knowledge that I have, but I'm not there with them, and I have to trust them, and I have to take them at their word for what they think are the best actions.
You mentioned that, you know, some don't use their cameras, and we're seeing a lot of the journalists using their phones now. Can you speak a little bit about this?
In terms of safety, or just in terms of?
Also in terms of just photojournalism and the increased use of phones.
Yeah, I mean, the phones they're phenomenal because they're tiny and they have very good cameras. But if you were to look, if we had side-by-side images, and this goes to the point that Rawan was making before about how good these photographers are, you would see a difference between an average person's cell phone photo and the photojournalist's cell phone photo. They are immensely skilled visual journalists, and I think the phone is another tool. It's another tool in their toolkit.
Thank you very much. Any final thoughts or any final questions? There's a question here.
Hi. We keep talking about using graphic imagery as to hold the Israeli government accountable, but I want to ask, what can the journalistic field do to hold the media accountable? We talked about New York Times, we know about The Atlantic, we know about Washington Post. What would accountability look like for them, and how can the rest of the field hold them accountable?
Do you want to talk about some?
So I'm going to quickly just like tell you about like a project that we worked on. I work with Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, and we've investigated the targeting of the journalists, and we've published several investigations over 2 rounds about the targeting of journalists in general. As like, you know, we looked at the numbers, we looked at where the journalists were getting killed. We found out that the journalists were actually getting killed at homes, most of them, so not in dangerous combat areas. And we've looked at individual cases of attacks against journalists as well as attacks against press infrastructure. and I'm going to point to my colleague here, Mariana from Forbidden Stories, who did a great piece on impunity, going into a lot of detail about like all the investigations that were supposed to happen and never happened as far as accountability for the killing of the journalists. And the piece ends with this line, Palestine is where international law goes to die.
I think the one thing that I might add, and I don't have a perfect answer for your question, but I do think it's a critical question. And I do hope it's a conversation that doesn't stop, 5 minutes from now and goes forward with outrage, right? The media is there to serve the governed. It's not there for those in power. It's not there to support the power structures. It's there to question. What I was thinking about while you were asking that question, though, was a kind of reframing. And one of the things that Samar said to me when I was talking to her, she said, pictures aren't enough. And what she was saying, to some extent, was the pictures are often thought to be the most emotional, or the kind of journalism that really moves the public at an emotional level, and sometimes that can be great, because if the pictures make you feel outraged, right, maybe you will act in response. But the burden for that to happen can't sit on the shoulders of the photojournalist. She and all of her colleagues are doing everything they can, but it won't take pictures alone. It's going to take a much bigger effort. And I really feel for photojournalists when I hear them say that, because I think they do put this burden on themselves, and it is an enormous, and it's an impossible burden. So I'm saying that actually for everyone, that we all have a role to play here. We have, if we're angered by the images, then we all have to find a way to move that anger forward.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for being here. I just want to let everyone know that at 6 o'clock there is a stand for the journalists right here, outside here. So if anyone would like to come, please join us. And thank you everyone for coming and sitting through these difficult stories and pictures.